picture the scenario for a second. It is 9:00 p.m. on a Sunday night. A high school sophomore is just lying in bed, staring at the ceiling.
Right.
And they aren't out causing trouble. They aren't, stubbornly refusing to do their homework. But their heart is racing, their jaw is clenched, and this very real, very physical sense of dread is just washing over them.
Yeah, the classic Sunday dread.
Exactly. And by the time Monday morning rolls around, they just don't get on the bus. Now, when you look at the school's administrative spreadsheet, that intensely human physical struggle is just, well, it's flattened into a single keystroke. A 0 in the attendance column, an unexcused absence.
It's the ultimate data illusion, really. I mean, we have these massive bureaucratic tracking systems designed to monitor compliance, basically, butts in seats.
Right.
And they end up entirely masking the biological reality of what is actually happening to the human being behind that 0.
And that is our mission for you, our listener, today. We are taking a deep dive into a fascinating set of sources, including a piece called Deciphering the Anxiety Behind Chronic Absenteeism, alongside some incredibly revealing intervention data from MentalSpace School.
Yeah, the data there is really eye-opening.
It really is. The goal here is to completely, basically fundamentally change how you read a spreadsheet of attendance data. We want to take you out of the mindset of like a frustrated administrator counting violations and put you into the mindset of a seasoned clinician looking for signals.
Because that is the core paradigm shift here.
Yeah.
Behaviors that almost universally get filed away as truancy or defiance or discipline problems, they're very often none of those things.
Yeah.
When you know how to decode the subtle patterns in the data, you start to see a map of hidden, overwhelming, and systemic anxiety. We're looking for biological footprints, not rule breakers.
Okay, let's unpack this, because
Okay.
if we're going to make this massive leap from truancy to treatment, we have to acknowledge the friction here. A lot of people might hear this and think, well, that sounds a bit overly permissive. But the source material actually proves that treating absenteeism as a clinical issue gets the results that traditional discipline completely fails to achieve.
Absolutely.
I mean, the data from MentalSpace School's interventions in Georgia K-12 schools is just wild. When they implemented their K-12 mental health framework, they saw an 89% improvement in attendance.
That's a huge jump.
Right. And they tracked a 92% reduction in anxiety and an 85% family satisfaction rate.
Yeah, and those numbers are practically unheard of in educational administration, especially when you consider how stubborn chronic absenteeism has been nationwide since the pandemic.
But I want to push back on this practically, because I think we can all agree that trying to fix a student's severe anxiety by slapping them with detention is, it's like trying to fix a blinking check engine light by smashing your car's dashboard with a hammer.
That's a great analogy.
You hide the warning, but the engine is still melting down. But from the perspective of a school principal, how do you actually prove that a kid is dealing with a genuine nervous system meltdown and not just, skipping first period to hang out at the convenience store with their friends?
What's fascinating here is that human biology cannot hide. It always leaves a temporal and behavioral footprint.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Well, a student who is casually skipping class to hang out with friends, they leave a very random, erratic data footprint. It's inconsistent.
Right.
But a student whose nervous system is in a constant state of alarm leaves a highly predictable, compounding pattern in the attendance software. And the reason MentalSpace schools see such massive improvements when they deploy things like family counseling and staff wellness initiatives is because they are addressing the root biological mechanism, not just the superficial symptom.
So the biology dictates the pattern on the spreadsheet. I really want to follow that thread. Let's actually walk through what this looks like over the course of a week for a student, starting with that Sunday night dread I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that brings us to our first major signal. The sources refer to this as the Sunday night dread, Monday absence pattern.
Right. And I know our listeners are very familiar with the concept of the Sunday scaries, that mild, annoying pit in your stomach at 7 p.m. on Sunday when you realize you have to go back to the office.
Right. Everyone knows that feeling.
But the sources are describing a version of this that is totally debilitating. If you are an educator looking at a spike in Monday absences month after month for a specific student, how does that translate into biology?
To understand the data, you really have to understand the mechanism of anticipatory anxiety. It all comes down to the HPA axis,
The what axis?
the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis in the brain. It's a mouthful, I know. But basically, over the weekend, the student's brain starts anticipating the sensory or social overload of the upcoming school week.
Okay.
And the HPA axis misinterprets this anticipation as a literal physical threat to survival. So by Sunday night, it starts dumping cortisol and adrenaline right into the student's bloodstream.
Wow. So their body is prepping for a tiger attack, but the tiger is like first period geometry.
Exactly. Their heart rate is elevated, their digestion halts, their muscles are tense, and this isn't a conscious choice they are making.
Right? It's purely biological at this point.
Yeah. By the time the alarm clock goes off on Monday morning, their sympathetic nervous system has completely hijacked their body. A student just looking to extend their weekend for fun doesn't present with this kind of compounding physiological exhaustion.
That makes total sense.
So when you see that disproportionate block of Monday absences in the system, you have to realize they literally cannot cross the threshold of the school building because their biology is screaming at them to run away.
Which makes the traditional bureaucratic response of, unexcused absence, warning letter sent home, seem almost tragically missing the mark. You are essentially penalizing a biological reflex.
And escalating the cortisol in the process, which just makes it worse for the following week.
Wow. Okay, let's follow this student's journey then. Let's say it's Tuesday or Wednesday. The anticipatory anxiety wasn't quite severe enough to keep them home, so they actually make it onto the bus, they get into the building, but the underlying issue is obviously still there.
Yeah, and this is where we see the second pattern emerge from the sources, which is the midday exit to the nurse.
Ah, okay.
So the student pushes through the morning, but eventually their physical capacity to suppress that fight or flight response just taps out, and they seek an escape hatch.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the sources call this somatic anxiety. Now, I know our listeners probably understand the basic concept of psychosomatic symptoms and mind affecting the body.
Right.
But in the context of a rigid school bureaucracy, this creates a massive blind spot. The student shows up to the nurse complaining of a headache, a stomach ache, or dizziness. They aren't walking in and saying, "Hi, I am having an anxiety attack."
Because they often don't have the vocabulary for it yet. But we have to be crystal clear on the mechanism here. Somatic anxiety is not faking it. The physical pain is entirely real.
Wait, really? It's actual pain?
Oh, absolutely. Think about the gut-brain axis. Your gut is lined with an entire network of neurons called the enteric nervous system, and it communicates directly with your brain via the vagus nerve.
Okay, I follow.
So when the brain is locked in chronic anxiety, the vagus nerve signals the gut to basically shut down normal operations. That results in actual painful cramping and nausea. The body is literally expressing the distress that the student's words cannot yet name.
But think about the practical reality of a public school nurse's office. A busy school nurse might see 50, 60 kids a day in this tiny windowless room. The student comes in, says, "My stomach hurts."
Yeah, happens all the time.
It is so incredibly easy for that nurse to just hand over a couple of saltine crackers, let the kid lie on the cot for 15 minutes, send them back to class, and consider the job done. How does an administration actually catch this signal before it just devolves into a daily cracker routine?
Well, this raises an important question about systemic awareness versus isolated treatment. If you treat the stomachache as an isolated medical event, you completely miss the forest for the trees. Schools have to be trained to spot the temporal pattern, the timing of the symptom.
The when, not the what.
Precisely. If you pull the clinic logs and see that a student is visiting the nurse every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 10:00 a.m., the primary issue is not their gastrointestinal tract.
Oh, wow.
The issue is whatever is happening on their schedule at 10:30 a.m.
It's the anticipation all over again, just localized to a specific period. But if the adults in the building dismiss it, if the teacher says, "Oh, they're just faking it to get out of my class," what does that do to the intervention process?
It destroys the foundation of trust entirely. If a child's brain is translating emotional distress into actual physical pain, and the adult authority figures dismiss that pain as manipulation, the child learns that the environment is hostile.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking.
It really is. You sever the connection required to eventually get them to open up to a clinician.
Yeah.
You have to validate the somatic pain first in order to eventually treat the underlying anxiety.
That makes profound sense. Okay, so we've covered the inability to start the week, which is the Monday absence. We've covered the body pulling the emergency brake midday, the somatic escape to the nurse.
Right.
Let's move to Thursday on our hypothetical student's calendar and look at the third pattern from our sources, specific class avoidance. So here, the student is physically fine. They're in the building. They attend most of their schedule, but they will do absolutely anything to avoid one specific room.
Yeah, unlike the general anticipatory dread of Monday, This pattern is highly environmental. It's
Yeah.
deeply situational. It's a targeted avoidance
So
behavior.
what triggers it?
The trigger could be a tricky peer dynamic in that specific room, maybe a personality clash with a teacher, or it could be a sensory issue. Maybe the lighting is harsh, the acoustics are loud, or the transition into the room is chaotic.
Or it could be a performance trigger, right? Like a fear of being called on randomly, or the absolute terror of a group
Oh,
presentation.
absolutely.
It makes me think of playing an incredibly difficult video game. You're navigating the map, your health bar is already pretty low just from surviving the week, and then you hit a boss level room that is just completely unbalanced.
Right.
Your character doesn't have the stats to beat it. So what do you do to survive the game? You just avoid that specific room on the map entirely. You do side quests in the hallway, you hide in the bathroom, you play the rest of the game, but you never ever go in that room.
The video game analogy is very apt, actually,
Hmm.
because the student's health bar is basically their nervous system's capacity to regulate.
Hmm.
And when they hit that room, their capacity drops to zero.
But here's where I really have to challenge the logistics of this. It's one thing to say, okay, the student is triggered by the fluorescent lights in the biology lab, or the student has a phobia of group work.
Sure.
But public schools are massive bureaucracies beholden to state standards. If the state curriculum mandates collaborative group projects for 10th grade history, the teacher is caught between a rock and a hard place. They can't just upend the curriculum and say, okay, no more group work for anyone just to accommodate one student's trigger.
No, they can't.
So how does a therapist actually thread that needle in a real-world classroom?
Well, and that is exactly why generalized sympathy from a teacher isn't enough. You need targeted, professional, clinical intervention. The goal of a therapist isn't to bulldoze the obstacle out of the student's path. The goal is to decode the trigger and equip the student to actually navigate the obstacle.
So you don't remove the boss level, you give the player better armor.
Exactly. This is why our sources highlight MentalSpace School's emphasis on utilizing culturally competent, licensed, diverse therapists. I mean, an exhausted math teacher doesn't have the time to figure out why a student is terrified of group work,
Right.
but a skilled therapist does. They can figure out if the fight or flight response is caused by a fear of peer judgment, maybe an undiagnosed auditory processing delay that makes multiple voices overwhelming, or perhaps a previous trauma.
That makes a lot of sense.
Once you identify the specific root of the trigger, you can develop an individualized coping mechanism for that student. This allows the teacher to stick to the curriculum while the student safely participates.
Which brings us to the most critical pivot of this entire deep dive. It is incredibly illuminating to understand the neurobiology of Monday absences, somatic stomach aches, and situational triggers.
Right.
But if a history teacher spots these patterns in their fourth period class and they have nowhere to send that student, the data point is practically useless.
Exactly. Identifying the signal is only step one. Step two requires robust infrastructure. You have to have a clinical framework waiting to receive the student the moment the educator spots the pattern.
So what does this all mean for the schools themselves? The sources lay out the comprehensive support system that MentalSpace School offers to K-12 schools in Georgia. And honestly, the scale of it is what makes it work.
It's massive.
They aren't just sending a pamphlet. They provide same-day teletherapy. They assign dedicated teams of therapists to specific schools, and they handle everything from routine counseling to crisis intervention and violence prevention.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what we were really talking about is tearing down the friction in healthcare access.
Right.
The traditional model forces a parent to notice the issue, navigate a labyrinth of out-of-network therapists, sit on a wait list for 6 months, and pay exorbitant copays.
It's a nightmare for parents.
It really is. By integrating the clinical framework directly into the educational ecosystem, MentalSpace School transforms the school from a place that merely reports academic failure into a proactive, frictionless mental health hub.
And let's talk about the biggest piece of friction for families, the financial barrier. The sources note that this framework is fully IPI compliant, meaning the healthcare data is secure, and FERPA compliant, which protects the student's educational record.
Right, which is crucial.
But the truly revolutionary part is the billing structure. Medicaid covers these services at $0 out of pocket for families.
That's huge.
And they accept a massive sweeping range of private insurances. BCBS, Cigna, Aetna, UHC, Humana, Peach State, CareSource, Amerigroup.
Yeah, that extensive list isn't just a corporate talking point. It is a structural triumph. It means that whether a child is under state care, on Medicaid, or under a parent's corporate insurance policy, they aren't turned away. The safety net has no holes.
And there is a massive legislative pressure cooker driving this right now, which the sources touch on with something called the HB 268 compliance deadline.
Oh, yes.
For our listeners who don't spend their days reading Georgia legislative bills, HB 268 is a state mandate requiring schools to implement actionable, standardized frameworks for student well-being and threat assessment. And the deadline for compliance is July 2026.
Which is rapidly approaching. Legislators are finally recognizing that public schools are the de facto mental health triage centers for our society, whether they are funded for it or not.
Right.
HB 268 is forcing schools to stop relying on ad hoc, informal counseling from overwhelmed guidance counselors and instead build rigorous compliant frameworks.
Makes sense.
By partnering with organizations like MentalSpace School, administrators can instantly align their campuses with clinical best practices and hit those state mandates without having to invent the wheel themselves.
It is the ultimate delegation of duties. You don't ask a 10th grade chemistry teacher to also be a behavioral psychologist. You simply ask them to notice the temporal pattern on the attendance sheet or the clinic log.
Right.
And then you give them an incredibly accessible, culturally competent team to hand the baton to, which, by the way, school administrators listening can find at mentalspaceschool.com or by emailing mentalspaceschool@chhtherapy.com to actually do the heavy lifting.
Exactly. It relieves the immense psychological burden on the educators, completely removes the logistical barrier for the parents, and most importantly, it drastically changes the life trajectory for the student.
It's an elegant solution to a brutally complex problem. All right, let's take a step back and recap the journey we've been on today. We started this deep dive looking at a cold, dry spreadsheet of chronic absenteeism.
Yeah.
And instead of viewing it as a list of unmotivated kids who just need a stricter discipline policy, we put on our clinical lenses.
We learned to see those spikes in Monday absences, not as kids wanting 3-day weekends, but as the boiling over of the HPA axis, a neurobiological fight-or-flight response to anticipatory anxiety.
We looked at those midday repetitive visits to the nurse's office not as a convenient way to get out of an upcoming math test, but as somatic anxiety. The gut-brain axis literally waving a white flag, translating emotional terror into real physical pain.
And we recognize that avoiding a single specific classroom isn't necessarily a defiant act of rebellion. It's often a strategic retreat from an overwhelming environmental or performance trigger at boss level that requires a skilled therapist to decode so the student can learn to cope.
We have fundamentally reframed the narrative from truancy to treatment, and I think whether you are an educator staring down your homeroom roster, a parent trying to decipher your teenager's sudden stomach aches, or just someone who is fascinated by the hidden mechanics of human behavior, you now have an entirely new lens for interpreting what looks like flaky behavior.
Absolutely.
It's not a violation, it's data. It is a biological signal asking for help.
It is, at its core, a profound shift in empathy.
It really is. And it leaves me with one final thought, something I want to leave you, our listener, to mull over on your own as you go about your week.
Okay.
We have spent this entire deep dive talking about teenagers and students. We've talked about how their chronic absenteeism is so often just a paper trail of unaddressed systemic anxiety. But what about us?
That's a great point.
If human biology operates this way for a 15-year-old, what might sudden unreliability, flakiness, or a string of cancellations in our adult lives, whether it's in our workplaces or even avoiding a specific friend group, really be trying to tell us about our own overloaded adult nervous systems?